Today, we are going to jump into the forbidden waters of Sodom and Gomorrah. What was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? Traditionally, it's been thought of as homosexuality, but is that true? And that's what I want to look at today. Most of what we know about Sodom and Gomorrah comes from the situation in Genesis 19 where Lot is pulled from the city and God destroys it. So we're going to look at Genesis 19. I'm not going to read it all because you probably know some of the story, but I just want to say this first. What we're going to talk about today is actually, there's a whole section of this in my book, An Inevitable Collision, How to Prepare Your Church for the Clash of Morality and a Gender-Confused Culture. You've got to get this book. Get it on Amazon. You can get it in Kindle or in paperback. Now, just today, I tried to advertise it on Amazon, even though it's sold on Amazon. I tried to advertise it, but they won't let me do it. And they didn't give a specific reason, just the generalities, or that it could contain things. I'm not going to read all this because I don't want to tag this video as, inappropriate. But they do not allow things such as BDSM. You can look that up for yourself, but this has nothing to do with that. Obviously, some sexual stuff, self-help content, or content that promotes, endorses, or incites potentially dangerous or harmful activity. So I'm not sure just what exactly this fits under, but this is not something that you're going to find very well accepted by many non-Christians, maybe even some Christians. And it's obviously not meant to be a hate thing. It's just how to help protect our churches against this thing that we have in the world, the LGBT agenda. So get it and put reviews on Amazon if you would. Let everybody know about it. I think it's going to be really helpful if people can read that. So back to Sodom and Gomorrah. What was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? Abraham's nephew, of course, Lot, was living in Sodom. And as the story goes, one night, or maybe I should say as the account goes, one night Lot was sitting in the gates of the city of Sodom, and these two men, and the Bible calls them angels, showed up, and they have this communication with Lot, and Lot takes him home to stay in his house all night. Now, we don't know for sure if Lot knew that they were angels, but he must have suspected something about these guys. He took them into his house. Now, the fact that that Lot was sitting in the gates of Sodom shows that he, at this point, was a respected citizen. People would actually go to the gates of the city to conduct business, hold court, and things like that. So when you were sitting in the gates of the city, it shows you were a respected citizen. And so that's where we find Lot here. He's moved into Sodom, and he is a respected citizen now. And these men come to the city at night, and Lot says, hey, you need to come to my house for the night. So he takes him into his house, and before they can all go to bed, the men of Sodom converged on his house and told Lot, you need to send these visitors out so we can know them. And that's where I want to pick up on this. We're going to look at this in Genesis chapter 19. Let me back it up. I actually want to look at verse 4. Now, before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. And they called to Lot and said to him, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them carnally. And so at this point, it almost seems like Lot may have suspected there was something special about these men. Maybe he knew at this point that they were angels. So he didn't allow this, but they persisted. So let's keep reading in verse 6. So Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly. See, now I have two daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof. And so he says, no, look, you can take my daughter, but don't take these men right here. I can't allow that. And what happened there was these two men then struck all these men of Sodom with blindness, so they couldn't do anything. And then they forced Lot and his wife and two of his daughters and took them out of the city of Sodom. God rained down fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities of the area. And Lot's wife was so interested in what was going on back in Sodom, she missed her life already, that she turned around and God transformed her instantly into a pillar of salt. And so here's the question that we have. What had these people done that requires such a catastrophic judgment from God? Traditionally, like I said, it's been understood that homosexuality was their primary sin. But is that a fair assessment? There's many people today that don't think so. And I want to look at this, and I think that we can actually make a case that that is exactly the sin that they had, among others. They had many sins, but this is maybe what we could call the primary one, or at least one of the very important sins that they had. So some scholars will argue this, and one I actually want to look at specifically is by Scott Morschauser. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right. Scott Morschauser. He had an article in 2003. It was in the Journal for the Study of the Old Testament, and the article was called "Hospitality, Hostiles, and Hostages on the Legal Background to Genesis 19, 1-9." So in this article, he suggests that these men, or that the men of Sodom came to Lot's house not to commit some kind of homosexual act with these visiting men, with the angels, but rather to interrogate them. And his point is that he thinks that as Lot was sitting there in the gates, his job was to play host for the city. He was on shift to play host for the city. And these two men came in, and part of Lot's job was to see if they were spies or not. And so he invites these men to his house. And now the men of Sodom came, and they also want to know these guys. They want to interrogate them to see if they're spies, if they should be allowed to stay or not. And then when Lot offered his daughters, instead, he said, hey, you can take my daughters. It wasn't that he was offering them as objects of his lust, but that he was offering them as collateral until these men were all done. The men of Sodom were all done interrogating the visitors. So that is one of the opinions that's out there. So it was basically a lack of hospitality that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah for. I really don't think that holds water. I'm going to give you a few reasons why, okay? First of all, when we look at this passage, if you're reading it in Hebrew, it would say yada. In English, it says no, that these men wanted to know the visitors, and that they took the Lot's daughters and or they wanted to take Lot's daughters and know them, that kind of a thing, okay? The Hebrew word is yada, which can refer to a sexual relationship, okay? We're only going to go that far, that it is possible linguistically that it can refer to a sexual relationship. As a matter of fact, Lot used the same word. Let me get it back up for you. In verse 8, when he's offering his daughters, he says, see, now I have two daughters who have not known a man. That's exactly the same word, yada. And it's very obvious in this situation, he's referring to them as virgins. They have not known a man. So it's obviously that this word refers to sexual, at least it can refer to sexual relationships. Okay. And by the way, this word is also used back in Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, where it says that Adam knew his wife Eve, and then she conceived and bore a son. And, I just have a hard time thinking that Adam went up, hi, I'm Adam, who are you? Oh, your name is Eve, oh, and then they have children. This word yada goes beyond just introducing yourself to someone, interrogating someone, getting to know them better. Okay, so it's very clear that this word in the Old Testament does at least often refer to the idea of a sexual relationship. This word also, by the way, appears in Judges chapter 19, a horrific story, an absolutely horrific story. The situation, this man had a concubine, and she ran off, and he went to get her. On the way back home, he stopped in Gibeah, and he stayed all night with an old man. Or this old man invited him in. He couldn't find a place to go, so this old man invited him into the house. And the men of Gibeah found out about this, and they came and they banged on the old man's door and asking for this man, this visitor, who was a Levite. They said, we want to know him. And instead, this is somewhat similar to Sodom, right? Instead, they gave this man's concubine to these people, and it said all night the men knew this woman. They knew her, yada. And in the morning, that when they came out, came back. She was half dead. She crawled out of the house that night, and she was laying there dead on the door, on the threshold when he came out in the morning. Now, you can't tell me that word yada just means in that situation that they interrogated her all night. They were asking her questions, getting to know her better. No, there was abuse here that was going on. So it's very clear that word yada, at least it can refer to this kind of a thing, okay? And I think actually it really does in this situation. Another thing we need to look at here is the whole context of the passage. Here with Sodom, the whole context indicates a sexual nature of their demand. Why else would Lot offer his daughters? Hey, you can have my daughters, explicitly stating that they were virgins, okay? So, hey, you can have them, their virginity wouldn't make any sense if they were just being offered up as collateral. Okay, so obviously these people intended sexual violence here. It was very clear that that's what's going on there in Sodom, and they wanted these men for it. Okay, another reason that I think it's clear that this is a homosexual thing that the people of Sodom were involved in. And by the way, this if this was the big thing that night, you know that it was a big thing in their town. It's not like just one night they decided, oh, let's do this. This is obviously something that's going on in Sodom here. Other places in the Bible hint at the idea of homosexuality being one of the sins of Sodom. And I want to actually go now to Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, and look at what he says about this. And this is a prophecy to Judah, specifically Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is compared to Sodom. And that, that was a slap in the face for these people, okay? Because they knew what was going on. He says, as I live, says the Lord God, neither your sister Sodom nor her daughters have done as you and your daughters have done. I mean, you guys aren't even as bad as Sodom. Look, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughter had pride, fullness of food, and abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. And so that was one of their sins, sure. But then look at this. And they were haughty and committed abomination before me. Therefore, I took them away as I saw fit. So he says they committed abomination against me. Likely he is thinking back to Leviticus 18:22, where God uses that same word to describe homosexuality. Just the fact that they weren't very nice to everybody, and they, fullness of food, and they had a lot of stuff that, that you don't really see that as an abomination. But when God specifically says that this act of homosexuality is an abomination before God, then I think that's what Ezekiel was connecting up here to. Now, one of the sins that Ezekiel specifically mentions here is pride, which is really at the root of homosexuality. And I just want to say this because I know it can sound real harsh, it can sound really mean, but sometimes you hear people say, well, God hates the homosexual. God does not hate the homosexual. Okay, the homosexual is not an abomination. It is the act. It is acting on that desire that is the abomination. So get that straight, get that clear, okay? Don't misunderstand this, because God loves people. God offers forgiveness to everybody. God offers forgiveness to you for whatever your sin is. So just keep that in mind, okay? This is not a hate thing. This is just looking, so what does the Bible say? That's what I'm interested in, even beyond what society says, because society is very often wrong. So he mentions pride, and pride is going against the way that God made me. And God made me a man, or maybe he made you a woman, and you're supposed to act within the confines of how he made you. When we step outside of that, then it's like saying, okay, God, I'm going to do what I want. I'll do it my way. So that is a sin of pride. And in this sense, it turned into homosexuality, and God says, hey, this is an abomination. Don't act like that. That's not the way that you were made. Even if you have those desires, you don't have to act on them. We have desires to do all kinds of things wrong that we shouldn't do. Some people might have a desire to murder, but that doesn't mean you should do it. You don't act on your desires. That's where the sin comes in. One more thing I want to point out is different Bible translations. As people translate the Bible, they understood this to mean homosexuality, where in this English Bible, I'm reading the New King James anyway, it says no. But a different translations, NIV and New Living Translation, they both say that they use the word sex there. They want to have sex with the male visitors, okay? New King James, like I read, uses the word no, but it adds carnally in italics, just trying to explain. The translators understood that that's what it meant. Then ASB translate the word as have relations. The word yada, no, they translate it as have relations. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, uses a word that also denotes sex. So you see there's so much that helps us understand that that's exactly what this is talking about here. One other thing I want to look at here is that the similarity between what went on in Sodom that night and what goes on in our society today. I don't think it's any coincidence that we use pride. If I were to say, I'm going to celebrate pride, what do you think? Most people automatically think the gay marriage or the gay agenda, LGBT, whatever, LGBTQ plus and all that. And that's what we think of when we think of pride. It's really not surprising, because there is pride in doing what we want to do as opposed to what God wants us to do, fitting within the confines of what he wants us to do. This night when these men came and tried to beat down Lot's door to try to get to these angels, these visitors, there was a lot of pride there. They had pride in their society. They had pride in their culture, and Lot was standing against it. And they weren't going to have anything to do with it. They weren't saying, okay, let's be tolerant here. Lot doesn't allow this. We'll go and find something else to do tonight. And you see this so much if you don't buy into the certain agenda that you are intolerant, right? And you're canceled, as we use the term today. But Genesis 19, verse 9, I want to look at this one more time. These angels, they said, stand back. Then they said, these are the people of Sodom. They said, this one came to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. So they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near to break down the door. I mean, these people absolutely want to fight against Lot. They say, Lot, you don't come in here and try to change up our society. This is the way that we are. You don't come in as an outsider and try to impose your morality on us. And this is exactly the kind of thing that we see today. Now you say, well, wait a minute here. You're telling me that homosexuality is wrong. You're imposing your morality on me, right? No, I'm just trying to be the messenger of God's morality. This is what God says. I didn't come up with this stuff. I'm trying to share what God said. That's why it's not hate. It's just trying to share the information. Look at what God did to Sodom and Gomorrah here. So Lot questioned their actions. He did not celebrate their sin. And they decided, we're going to destroy this man here. He was just trying to point out, hey, this is not right. We can't do that. Today in our society, if we try to not only just point out what's wrong with this kind of lifestyle, but just not celebrate it. Even if we're mum, but we just don't celebrate that kind of a lifestyle. We're called anti-gay, we're called homophobic, discriminatory, whatever it is. And that's not true. We love the people. We're just saying, hey, this is a sin that is wrong, just like premarital sex is wrong. Anything extramarital like that is wrong. There's so many things that are wrong, but this is one that is so blatant in our society today, and that's in a way, it's kind of being used against those of us who believe what God says about morality. So that's the same kind of tactic they used against Lot way back then. You can't come in here. You can't change our society here. You're the outsider. And we as Christians are really kind of the outsiders to our society. We accept that, okay, because we believe the things that God says. So I do believe that the primary sin anyway of Sodom was homosexuality, and we see it played out so clearly that night. So if you have any comments, let me know. No hate mail, please. I guess that's fine as people, not everyone's going to agree with this or not, but fight the ideas, not the people. Okay, we love you guys. Thank you so much for watching, regardless of what your opinions are. I love to hear from you, and hopefully I get to see you in the next video. Don't forget to look up on Amazon and Inevitable Collision. Buy it and review it after you read it. God bless you guys. I'll see you next time.